Mercedes just pulled off a perfect weekend in China. A 1-2 finish. Total dominance. Not a single weakness. And now, the FIA is stepping in. Because what they discovered after the race could make that performance illegal. We're talking about an engine that doesn't fade. An energy system that never seems to run out. A straight line advantage that no other team can explain. And here's the part that should worry everyone. This isn't just faster. It's consistently faster, in every phase that matters. Which should not be possible under current rules. So now the entire grid is asking one question. Is this genius engineering? Or something that crosses the line? Because if the FIA decides it's the second, Mercedes doesn't just lose an advantage. They lose the foundation of their dominance. Stay here, because the detail that exposes what's really happening comes later. And once you hear it, you'll understand why this changes everything. Subscribe now. Right after the Chinese Grand Prix ended, the mood inside the paddock changed. Not celebration. Not surprise. Suspicion. Because what Mercedes showed across that weekend didn't just look strong. It looked controlled in a way that made engineers uncomfortable. From the very beginning, the pattern was obvious. Practice sessions. Same names at the top. Russell. Antonelli. Lap after lap. No fluctuation. No drop. Just consistent pace that never seemed to fade. And that's unusual. Even dominant cars show variation. Wind changes. Track evolution. Tire degradation. Something always disrupts perfection. But not here. The W17 looked locked in. Stable through high-speed sections. Sharp on corner entry. Clean on exit. And then, the straights. This is where everything starts to feel different. Because every other car on the grid shows it. That moment, halfway down the straight. When energy begins to drop. When deployment fades. When speed plateaus. Mercedes didn't have that moment. They just kept accelerating. Smoothly. Continuously. Like there was no limit to manage. And in modern Formula 1, that should not happen. Energy deployment is restricted. Carefully regulated. You have to choose where to use it. Where to save it. Where to sacrifice. But Mercedes didn't look like they were sacrificing anything. And that's when rival teams started paying very close attention. Because this wasn't just visible on track. It was visible in the data. Speed traces showed it. Not a spike. Not a sudden gain. A sustained advantage. From the start of the straight to the braking zone. And that consistency is what raised the first real concerns. But here's where it gets more interesting. Because Ferrari, for example, wasn't far off. In the corners, they were competitive. Sometimes even stronger. Better traction. Better rotation. More grip at low speed. But every time they exited onto a straight, they lost ground. Again. And again. And again. Not dramatically. But enough to make overtaking impossible. Enough to make defending useless. Enough to decide the race. And that's exactly what we saw. Antonelli taking the lead back on lap 1. Not with risk. Not with aggression. With inevitability. Because once the straight began, there was nothing Ferrari could do. Now think about that. A team that is competitive in corners. Strong in traction. Solid on tire management. Still unable to fight back. Because of what happens in one phase of the lap. That's not normal balance. That's a structural advantage. And in Formula 1, structural advantages don't stay unquestioned for long. But at this point, it still looked like excellence. Smart engineering. Perfect integration. Nothing more. At least on the surface. Because behind the scenes, the analysis had already started. Engineers looking deeper. Comparing expected behavior with actual performance. And slowly, a new question began to form. Not how fast Mercedes is, but how they're sustaining that speed. Because if that answer doesn't fit cleanly within the regulations, then this story isn't about dominance anymore. It's about something much bigger, and much more dangerous. And this is where the story stops being comfortable for Mercedes. Because once you move from what you see to what you measure, things start to change. After China, teams didn't just review highlights. They went into the data. Deep telemetry comparisons. Speed overlays. Energy usage models. And very quickly, a pattern became impossible to ignore. Because under normal conditions, every car on the grid follows the same fundamental rule. Energy is limited. If you deploy early, you pay later. If you save early, you gain at the end. There is always a trade-off. Always a compromise. But Mercedes didn't show one. Their deployment looked flat. Consistent from the beginning of the straight to the very end. No visible drop. No clipping. No moment where the car runs out of electrical support. Just continuous acceleration. And that is where the discomfort turns into concern. Because that kind of behavior suggests one of two things. Either Mercedes has found a level of efficiency no one else can reach, or they are operating in an area the rules didn't fully anticipate. Now here's where the situation becomes even more sensitive. Because the FIA doesn't just look at peak performance. They look at patterns, repeated behavior, consistency over multiple laps. And in China, Mercedes showed the same thing. Every lap, every stint. No degradation in energy delivery. No instability. No randomness. That's not just performance. That's control at a level that forces questions. And those questions are now being asked. Quietly, but very directly. Because rival teams have started to compare their own limitations with what Mercedes is doing. And the gap isn't just speed. It's behavior. It's how the car behaves when it should be reaching a limit. And instead, it keeps going. Now imagine being an engineer from another team. You know exactly where your system peaks. You know when your deployment fades. You know the limits, because you hit them every lap. And then you look at Mercedes, and those limits don't appear. That's when suspicion becomes pressure. And pressure is what reaches the FIA. But here's the crucial detail. This is not an accusation. Not yet. This is something more subtle. A question about interpretation. Because Formula One regulations are precise, but not always absolute. There are areas where innovation lives. Small windows where teams can gain advantage. And Mercedes may have found one of those windows. But if that window is too effective, too dominant, too difficult for others to replicate, it doesn't stay open for long. That's when the FIA steps in. Not to punish, but to redefine, to clarify, to close the gap between what is written and what is possible. And that's exactly what could happen next. A technical directive. A small change in wording. A clarification about how energy can be deployed and sustained. And suddenly, what Mercedes is doing today might not be allowed tomorrow. And here's why that matters more than anything else. Because this isn't a small advantage. This is the core of their performance. Take away that sustained deployment, and you don't just lose top speed. You lose overtaking power. You lose defensive strength. You lose control of the race. Everything we saw in China starts to disappear. And if that happens, the entire balance of the grid shifts. Because Ferrari is already close. Closer than the results suggest. Strong in corners. Competitive on tires. Waiting for that one weakness. And if Mercedes loses even a fraction of this advantage, that weakness finally appears. But there's one more layer. And this one might decide everything. Because Mercedes knows exactly what they've built. They understand where their advantage comes from. And more importantly, they know how close it is to the limit. So now they face a situation every dominant team eventually faces. Do you defend what you have? Or do you prepare for losing it? Because if the FIA acts, there won't be time to adapt. No gradual adjustment. No slow decline. It will be immediate. And that's what makes this moment so critical. Because right now, Mercedes is at the peak. Everything works. Everything aligns. But the attention is growing. The scrutiny is increasing. And the next move won't come from the track. It will come from the rulebook. And when it does, what we saw in China might suddenly make a lot more sense. And now, we arrive at the part that could change everything. Because the FIA doesn't move without a reason. And right now, they have one. After reviewing the data from China, what started as quiet curiosity is beginning to turn into action. Not public, not dramatic, but very real. Behind the scenes, discussions are already happening about how energy deployment is being interpreted. Not whether Mercedes is cheating, but whether what they're doing should still be allowed. And that difference is crucial. Because in Formula One, you don't always need to break the rules to lose your advantage. Sometimes, the rules change around you. Now think about what that means. If Mercedes has found a way to deploy energy more efficiently than anyone else, a way that stays within the written limits, but stretches the intent of those limits, then the FIA has a decision to make. Do they allow innovation to continue? Or do they step in to protect competitive balance? And history tells us they usually step in. Not immediately, not aggressively, but decisively. Because Formula One cannot allow one team to operate in a space no one else can reach. Especially if that space decides races. And in China, it clearly did. Now here's where things become critical. Because the kind of action the FIA is considering doesn't come with warnings. It comes with clarification. A technical directive. A small document. A few lines of text. But those lines can redefine everything. They can specify how energy must be deployed. How it must decay. How it cannot remain constant over time. And if those definitions change, even slightly, Mercedes is forced to adapt. Immediately. No time to redesign. No time to rebuild. Just adjust and deal with the consequences. And those consequences could be massive. Because what we saw in China wasn't just speed. It was sustained superiority. A car that never dropped off. A system that never blinked. Take that away. And suddenly, Mercedes becomes human again. Beatable. Vulnerable. And right behind them, Ferrari is ready. Closer than ever. Waiting for exactly this moment. Because they don't need to find seconds. They just need Mercedes to lose a fraction. And if that happens, the fight is on. But there's something even more important. Something deeper. Because this situation reveals a pattern we've seen before. A team pushes the limits. Finds something special. Dominates. And then, the sport reacts. Regulations evolve. Advantages disappear. And a new balance is created. Mercedes may be living that exact moment right now. At the peak, just before the shift. And the most dangerous part for them is timing. Because this is only the second race of the season. China is done. The data is fresh. The attention is high. And any action taken now will affect everything that comes next. The championship. The momentum. The internal dynamics between their drivers. Because let's not forget, Antonelli just proved he can win. Russell won the sprint. 2 drivers. 1 dominant car. And now, potential uncertainty. That combination can explode. Because if performance drops, even slightly, the internal fight becomes real. More aggressive. More risky. More difficult to control. And that's when mistakes happen. Not because the car isn't fast, but because the situation isn't stable anymore. So now, everything is aligned for a turning point. External pressure. Internal tension. Regulatory attention. And a car that might be operating right at the edge of what's allowed. The question is no longer if Mercedes is fast. That's already proven. The real question is how long they'll be allowed to stay this fast. Because if the FIA acts, what we saw in China was not the start of a dominant era. It was the warning sign before everything changes. And the final piece of this puzzle? The one detail that explains exactly what Mercedes might be doing differently with their energy system is still hidden. But once that detail comes out, it won't just explain their speed. It will explain why the FIA had no choice but to step in.